Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Alright, guys. Time to give Justinian another chance. I'm not a fan, okay? I'm not a fan from what I saw in the Belisarius Epic History TV videos. Anyways, let's go. My name's Connor. Hello. From Swineherd to Emperor. Extra history. Number 1, Justinian and Theodora. Theodora was good. Preemptive like. Let's do it.
The West has fallen. Britannia was abandoned centuries ago. Gaul is overrun by the Franks. Hispania is a Visigothic province now, and North Africa has fallen to the Vandals. Worst of all, Italy, and thus Rome itself, has become an Ostrogothic kingdom. Only the East still stands. But even in
Guys, who are the Vandals again? Vandals, Germanic people who first inhabited what is now southern Poland and established... Interesting how all of these different Germanic and Nordic peoples and Slavic peoples went on to conquer different parts. You'd think that... anyways, sorry, let's go.
In the east, Huns and Bulgars press in on the north, and in the south, war rages with the mighty Sassanid Empire. Not even Anatolia, the heart of the empire, home of Constantinople herself, is safe. And yet today, all around us, we see the legacy of Eastern Rome. In the heart of Istanbul stands the Hagia Sophia. Its great domes housed the largest cathedral in the world for 1,000 years, and even now, 1,500 years after its construction, it stands as a wonder for us all. Every day in courtrooms half the world over, decisions are made rooted in the legal framework laid out in the Corpus Juris Civilis. And in the apse of the Basilica in San Vitale, if you look up, you will see the most renowned emperor of the East looking down on you from a mosaic nearly 1,500 years old. And these things that are left to us are almost all the work of one man, one emperor, Justinian. He was perhaps the greatest emperor of the Byzantines, and the last of them to dream of a restored Rome, to dream of a Unibizantines, and the last of them to dream of a
Rome restore. Restore Rome can help fix problems that might be making your country run slowly or stop responding.
restored Rome, to dream of a unified Christian church, to dream in marble and gold and steel. Never again would the Roman Empire see the heights it saw under this one man, and never again would anyone come so close to bringing the West back into the light of Rome. But Justinian's legacy is mixed. Unlike those heroic emperors who kept Rome and then Byzantium from being forever extinguished when complete collapse looked inevitable, Justinian took an empire that was beset on all sides but still strong and raised it to magnificence.
Okay, let me just get my coffee quick.
But in doing so, he may have gambled too many of its resources, expended too much of its strength on a dream. Justinian is one of my favorite Roman emperors because he had the boldness to dream in a way that no one else did, and he had the energy, the drive, and the capacity to back up those dreams. He was intelligent.
Guys, I am forming a prejudice based on very little information before that is sticking in my brain, and I gotta shake it off. I'm sorry, okay?
Justinian is one of my favorite Roman emperors because he had the boldness to dream in a way that no one else did, and he had the energy, the drive, and the capacity to back up those dreams. He was intelligent, wise, diligent beyond measure, working tirelessly for his people, but his reign was not without blood, not without miscalculations, and not without human failings and distrust. And so for the next few weeks, we'll dive into the reign of this most spectacular emperor, and his renowned empress, Theodora. But before we can get to Justinian and Theodora, we have to talk about Justin, the uncle to Justinian, without whom Justinian may never have been. Because before Justinian was an emperor, he was a peasant. And before he was Justinian, he was Flavius Petrus Sabatius. He changed his name to honor his uncle and benefactor, Justin. Justin's one of those wild American dream sort of stories. He himself began as a peasant farmer in a remote western corner of the empire. He spoke Latin in a world that had become almost entirely Greek and owned nothing but the clothes on his back. But despite all this, he made his way to that monumental city, the heart of the empire, Byzantium, and sought his fortune. He joined the army and was assigned to the palace guard. He quickly rose through the ranks, and as he did so, he brought his family to join him. Having no children of his own, he doted on his nephew, young Flavius Petrus Sabatius. And while he, Justin, was an illiterate farmer, he was determined to give his young nephew Sabatius the finest education in law, theology.
How could he teach him if he didn't know how to, other teachers?
Farmer, he was determined to give his young nephew Sabatius the finest education in law, theology, and rhetoric. He also made sure to get Sabatius appointed to the royal guard, and in gratitude, Sabatius took on the name Justinianus, or as we call him, Justinian. Then Justin, and by extension Justinian's big break came. When the Emperor Anastasius, the emperor who Justin served, died, he left the throne without an heir, and a succession crisis began. Justin, at this point being the head of the executors, or the imperial guard, and thus the only guy with troops in the capital city, was going to be essential to deciding who the next emperor would be. So one of the imperial officials tried to bribe Justin in order to get him to support their favored candidate. But Justin, probably at the suggestion of Justinian, promptly took the bribe and used it to bribe influential senators to support him instead. As he had the only troops in town and the support of the
What?
Senate,
Okay.
Justin was report him instead. As he had the only troops in town and the support of the Senate, Justin was raised to the imperial purple. But Justin had no education. He only had experience as a soldier and a swineherd, and he realized he would need help running the empire. Doubly so because he was seen by many as less legitimate than the nephews of the previous emperor, who were still alive. And
I can't believe the seat was so open after that guy died that it's just like, oh, who's the strongest general?
For this help, he turned to Justinian. Justinian rapidly went to work, closing the rift between the church in Rome and the Byzantine church, an act which lent legitimacy to Justin's reign, while at the same time pardoning and promoting the most talented men who the previous emperor had imprisoned or condemned, securing Justin loyalty within the palace. Next, Justinian had to secure Justin's new reign on a military front, so he also made peace with a popular general named Vitalian, who had rebelled against the religious policies of Justin's predecessor, and still had an army inside Byzantine borders. Unfortunately, Vitalian was a little too popular, and in an act which displays the ruthlessness that Justinian tried to avoid but certainly wasn't above, Justinian had Vitalian assassinated shortly after he returned to Byzantium. Because Justinian was a man who just did everything at once, it was also about this time that he met Theodora. Theodora was intelligent, witty, charming, and always the center of attention wherever she went. But she was also an actress, and as was common for actresses at this time, had worked as a prostitute and an escort. So how did this former escort meet the man who was second only to the emperor himself? Well, she was an ardent supporter of the blue faction of the deems. What the heck is a deem, you might reasonably ask? The deems were the chariot racing teams in Constantinople, and this may sound
that sounds so cool. The fact that there were like teams and people bet on certain teams. Like, when I think of chariot races and, like, gladiator I just think of, like, people thrown in to get slaughtered or something, and obviously that's not right. And I'm learning. And I'm sorry about any prejudices I have against Justinian, okay? I know it's probably a bit annoying hearing someone like me being so adamantly... have adamant feelings about him despite not knowing enough to have those feelings, okay? So I get it. I'm learning. But it's cool how they had, like, it was much more organized in chariot races and whatnot than I thought. Aliens, Giorgio Tsoukalos.
Reasonably ask. The deems were the chariot racing teams in Constantinople, and this may sound crazy, but they are absolutely essential to understanding Byzantine history. They played an enormous role in the life of the average citizen of Constantinople. You can think of them as a sports club, a political organization, a community group, and a moving riot all rolled into one. By the time of Justinian, the chariot races were basically the sport in Constantinople. With the rise of Christianity, gladiatorial combat was functionally outlawed, so everyone, and I mean everyone, turned out for the chariot races. The Hippodrome, the arena for chariot races in Constantinople, could seat over 100,000 people. Just think about that. Even by today's standards, that would make it one of the biggest stadiums in the world. And think about what 100,000 people standards that would
Beaver Stadium, Michigan Stadium, Run Grotto.
Make it one of the biggest stadiums in the world. And think about what 100,000 people all in one place means for a city like Constantinople. If those folks all decide they want something, it's going to be very hard to turn them down. And the two teams, the Blues and the Greens, were not only sports clubs, but also organized political agitation. The average member of each of the deems was basically a soccer hooligan, always ready for a good riot, which meant that the upper echelons of society would use the deems to promote their political agendas. Thus, through the deems, sometimes the highest and lowest members of society would meet, and thus Justinian met Theodora. Justinian was a fanatical supporter of the blues, often using his political clout to protect them from the law. The blues served as a power base for him in the city, and in turn, he had the constabulary turn a blind eye when members of the blues were involved in coercion or extortion or occasionally outright banditry. Through the blues, Justinian and Theodora met and instantly fell in love. And although they lived together, they couldn't marry because there was a law against government officials marrying actresses, a law which he would get his uncle to repeal as soon as he had the power to do so. Unfortunately for Justinian and Theodora, Justin's wife, much as she loved her nephew, wouldn't let him repeal this law. But shortly after her death, the law was wiped from the books, and Justinian and Theodora became husband and wife. Justin followed his wife shortly thereafter, dying on the 1st of August 527, leaving the empire in the sole hands of Justinian. Join us next time as we watch Justinian burst into action.
Yes, go.
Last time, we saw the Emperor Justin rise from a peasant pig farmer with a little help from his nephew Justinian. Today, we'll see what happens when power changes hands and Justinian becomes sole ruler of Rome. Turns out, a lot happens. Upon coming into his own, Justinian bursts into a flurry of action, nearly unparalleled in history. He reformed almost every aspect of the empire, trying to fix 1,000 years of bureaucracy and neglect. But he didn't do it alone. He elevated a cast of some of the most talented, most diligent men in the history of the empire to attack all the things he saw wrong with the Imperium. Unfortunately, these brilliant, hard-working servants of the empire were also some of the most corrupt, quirky, and colorful characters the empire would ever see. So today, we're just going to work through Justinian's reforms by introducing you to these characters and what they did. First off, Justinian was a big spender. He wanted to build up the military, increase infrastructure, create...
Shut up and take my money.
Justinian was a big spender. He wanted to build up the military, increase infrastructure, create monumental public works, and throw lavish games. But to do all this, he needed coin. And one of the problems the Roman Empire struggled with from its inception, one of the problems that helped bring down the West and had almost brought down the East, was tax collection. The rich would avoid their taxes, and the poor couldn't pay. And this just would not fly for Justinian. So he brought in John the Cappadocian. I mean, he even sounds like a mobster, doesn't he? This guy, John the Cappadocian, totally overhauled the tax system in the empire. He moved tax collection out of the hands of local officials. He crushed corruption within the ranks of the tax collectors, and one of his less popular reforms, at least with some segments of society, was torturing rich people until they paid their taxes. Of course, he was also a debauched glutton who skimmed from the taxes to feed his own perversions. Reports abound of his greed, his sexual appetites, and his boorish, slave-like treatment of his staff. Abound of his greed, his sexual appetites, and his boorish, slave-like treatment of his staff. Now, of course, many of these are exaggerations. After all, nobody likes the tax man, and being a more efficient tax collector probably isn't going to win you a glorious place in contemporary histories. But there are enough of these reports that I think we can assume this guy was likely running a very whistle-clean tax administration while shaking people down and engaging in some Baron Harkonnen-like good times himself. With the money he needed taken well care of, Justinian also attacked the second problem of the empire, the legal code. For 1,000 years, laws had been added, changed, and overturned without anybody really collating them, rationalizing them, or really putting them together in any way that wasn't contradictory. At this point, a lot of them just plain didn't make sense, putting them together in any way that wasn't contradictory. At this point, a lot of them just plain didn't make sense. This meant that the law courts had become clogged, corruption was rampant, and justice through the legal system was simply not available for most people. Justinian planned to end this, and so he brought in Tribonian. Tribonian was one of the most brilliant legal minds of all time. In
Recognizable name? Maybe I'm imagining things.
14 months, he untangled a millennium of Roman law and had a new law code ready to publish. Then he compressed 1,500 existing books of legal decisions down to a mere 50-book set, making the law comprehensible and approachable. With Justinian's help, he then had these books ruled to supersede all previous legal decisions, so that all lawyers and judges were working from the same law. He rounded out these mind-boggling feats by writing an accessible textbook for all future lawyers to learn from, and together, these books form the Corpus Juris Civilis, the work that today's civil law is founded on. Of course, Tribonian was also an unabashed pagan, throwing sacrilegious parties and feasts even as Justinian was ostensibly cracking down on paganism. He was also utterly corrupt, or as one author once put it, every day he repealed or enacted some law at the instance of people who purchased this from him. Otherwise, of course, he was known for being good-natured, diplomatic, and only a little bit of a fop. With the Herculean task of reforming the entire canon of...
What? I just imagine, like, make it illegal to anyone. I don't know.
And only a little bit of a fop. With the Herculean task of reforming the entire canon of Roman law safely in the hands of perhaps the only man in history who might actually be up to the challenge, Justinian could finally turn his eye on military affairs.
Belisarius?
Justinian dreamed of reconquering the West, of reuniting and recreating an empire that had only fallen some 50 years before. He dreamed of restoring Rome. But at the time, the Romans were being kicked around by the Sassanid Persians all across the southern half of the empire. Before Justinian could turn his eye west, he had to stop the Persians from taking over what empire there was left. And for this, he had one of the best generals history has ever produced. A man easily the rival of Napoleon or Alexander.
Really? Belisarius is the Chad of Chads. He's awesome. Did all of Justinian's dirty work, and Justinian owes him a lot.
Though his name's not so well known. A man named Belisarius. From an early age, Justinian recognized this man's brilliance, and by the time Belisarius was 25, he was Magister Militum, or theater commander of the East. But to talk about Belisarius, we have to talk about the Battle of Dara. At this point, Roman armies had suffered defeat after defeat at the hands of the Persians. The situation looked hopeless. Belisarius had been ordered to gather together whatever troops he can and hold the town of Dara, a small fortress town that guarded the entrance to Anatolia. If the Sassanid army got past there, they'd be in the heart of the empire. Envoys were sent from the imperial court to sue for peace, but the Persian king would have none of it. His army moved toward Dara. Reports start coming in of the strength of the Persian army. 50,000 men. 50,000. Belisarius looked to his troops, standing on the walls of his desert border fort. 25,000 men. Belisarius wanted to hole up, to fight from behind these walls. It was the only way they'd have a chance against an army twice their size. But he knew that if he did that, the Persians would just go around him. Behind him was nothing but farmers in their fields and priests in their churches. No, he had to stop them here, so he prepared to fight. A messenger galloped up from the Persians and handed him a note. It was from the enemy commander. It said, "Prepare me a bath, for tomorrow I shall bathe in this fortress." Belisarius ordered his men to dig. The next day, the armies lined up for battle. The massive Persian army with their infantry in the center and the famed immortals on the wings. The Byzantine army lined up...
So immortals were called immortals because they just, like, kept replacing them to make sure that they were at the same number? Because that's a pretty good, psychological warfare tactic.
Across from it, with their infantry anchoring the center behind a great trench they had dug on Belisarius' command, with heavy cavalry on the wings, lighter cavalry in reserve, and a small force of Huns hidden behind a hill. The Persian cavalry charged. The wings were a whirling melee of horses and men. But the center, the infantry holding the Byzantine center, just stood there behind their trench. The Persian commander faltered. Even with his numbers, he didn't want to charge his infantry over that trench. His cavalry were doing well. He would let them win the day. Once they'd routed the Roman cavalry, they could circle behind the infantry and negate Belisarius' improvised defense. And like that, the Persians pinned their own infantry, giving up their massive advantage in numbers. Then, just as the cavalry melee was swinging toward the Persians, the Huns sprang from their hiding place. All of a sudden, the Persians' right flank was in disarray. They were falling back. But no matter, there was still time to rally them. The left flank was still doing well. They'd pushed the Romans beyond the trench line. They were pursuing the Roman cavalry almost to the walls of Dara itself. But the rest of the Persian army was still where it had begun. There was a huge gap between the immortals who had chased the Byzantine cataphracts and the infantry that had never moved. The Persian
They're not immortals anymore. They can't replenish.
Cavalry had chased the Byzantines so far that they were now behind enemy lines, and their infantry was way too far away to support them. The Roman cavalry reserve charged. The main Byzantine cavalry rallied. The immortals were surrounded, cut off. Discipline fell apart. Each man tried to hew his way out, but one by one they fell. And now the Byzantines, having...
Wait, were they... Question, guys. Question. Were they immortals because during battle they would always have a certain number? Or just that, like, every battle where they show up, they'd always be replenished? Are they...
The only cavalry left on the field knew it was their turn to ride the Persians down. No Sassanid commander would be bathing in Dara that day. This victory paved the way for peace in the east. The Empire would still have to pay dearly for it, 11,000 pounds of gold, but now the southeastern border could be secured, and Justinian could turn to the west. Now, following our pattern, this is where you might expect me to tell you of Belisarius' flaws, but by all accounts he was a stand-up guy. So instead, I'm going to tell you about a historian who was Belisarius' legal advisor and came on all of his campaigns, a fellow named Procopius. Procopius is our—
Guys, there's something weird about this in history that I've noticed, and it's always kind of been in the back of my mind, but I know there's no solution, so it's kind of pointless to think about. But the fact that so much, you know how people say, like, history was written by the winner, and obviously that's a very, you know, to say that everything written in history is wrong, I think would be wrong to say. But the fact that they all have their own personal historians and I just don't know how reliable they are. And obviously, if you're a ruler, and the crazier, the more likely, you're going to want to make sure everything is written well about you. So there's just a little bit of that problem of me not quite trust. Do you know what I mean? I hope you get what I'm trying to say. I obviously we have to go from the sources we have, and yet not take them as concrete. This is definitely what happened, like a scientific approach.
Our principal source for Justinian's reign. By being with Belisarius, he had a front row seat to almost every major event. His work is thorough and comprehensive. It's a historian's dream. Thanks to him, the reign of Justinian is perhaps one of the best documented periods in Byzantine history. But, and here's where it gets wild, in the 1600s, in an archive in the Vatican Library, there was found a book, a hidden secret book, called The Secret History, also by Procopius. And while Procopius's official histories paint the reign of Justinian as glorious with a handful of failings mixed in, his secret history talks of Justinian as a monster. And I don't mean like a figurative monster, I mean a demonic creature that could pop off its head and wander the palace headless late at night. It depicts Theodora as debauched and depraved, and spares no one in Justinian's inner circle. Now,
well, so this was found. It's not like he was trying to push it anywhere, which makes me think it's more maybe have a
Today, most historians see Procopius's principal histories as highly valuable, and regard the secret history as little more than slander from some noble who was angered by the way Justinian eroded the power of the nobility.
Or just like
but
a diary.
Where else will you find a secret history hidden away for centuries, penned by the same guy who served as the glowing chronicler of the reign, filled with demons and monsters and the most slanderous critique? Nothing in the reign of Justinian and Theodora was done small. Sorry we didn't quite get to talking about the deems like I promised last time, but there's just so much going on within the first few years of Justinian's reign.
Next.
Don't you worry though, next time, prepare to witness the deems' full fury in the Nika revolt.
Let's do it! I think I'll stop after this part and do the next 3 later.
We stand upon execution grounds in Constantinople. 7 men are lined up to die. One by one, they drop. The first man falls, ropes snap taut, feet tremble. The second man falls, then the third, the fourth, and the fifth. Then the final 2 drop. There's a deafening crack, a retort that rings throughout the courtyard. Then silence, and then frantic action. 2 men are on the ground, gasping,
Reminds me of, so are they going to be saved now because they survived an execution? Because this is, I just watched the Russian, the Decembrist video from Epic History TV, and 2 of them, the ropes snapped, and I know it's common, like, that's like a sign from God, like, oh, they survived the execution, that means God wanted them to stay. But it's funny how they just, like, the Decembrist guy just insulted them, saying you can't even hang me right, and then they just did it again. So are they gonna save these guys?
Grabbing their necks. The echoes of the sound, a sound not of bones breaking but of ropes snapping, still bounce from the stone. The guards look about confused. The executioner has yet to even become aware of his error. A group of monks from the nearby monastery of St. Conon, who have been watching from the crowd, surge forward to gather up the men. They can't let such suffering continue. The guards move to stop them, but the crowd bars their way. The monks procure a small boat and row the men across the winter waters of the Bosporus to the Church of St. Lawrence to ask sanctuary of the priests inside. Soon the guards arrive, but the men are already safely within the church. They have sanctuary. The guard commander posts men at all the exits. He'll starve them out. It's not long before a crowd starts to gather. The men who were hanged, and the men who escaped, these were men of the deems, men of the chariot racing factions that played such a huge part in Byzantine life. The deems, the sports clubs that had a hand in everything from running the city fire departments to making major political decisions, had become more and more unruly, more and more lawless over the preceding years. During a riot that had broken out after a chariot race a few weeks earlier, several people were murdered. A little hooliganry could be tolerated, but that was too much. Order had to be maintained in the capital, so 7 of the ringleaders were marked to die for their crimes. But 2 of them didn't die, and they would serve as the tinder that would set Constantinople alight. On January 13th, 532, the Emperor Justinian entered his box in the Hippodrome, like he would for any other race. But these races, the races to celebrate the Ides of January, were to be different. The crowd began to shout for clemency, to beg the emperor to forgive the 2 men still holed up in the church. Race after race went by, and they continued to loudly implore the emperor. But the emperor was silent. He'd had too much of the deems controlling his city. Law would be restored. But as the last few races were being set up, the crowd's chant changed. They began to chant, "Long live the merciful blues and greens," because, as fortune dictated, of the men hiding in the church, the ones who'd escaped, 1 was from each of the deems. Then, suddenly, someone shouted, "Nika!" Then the crowd, perhaps tens of thousands strong, began to shout it at the emperor. Nika was the cry for victory. It meant conquer, and usually the blues and greens would shout it at one another, taunting each other as their racers won, or encouraging their champions as they sped around the track. But here, now...
People. Nika! 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 Sorry.
Now, with one voice, the entire stadium screamed it at the emperor. The deems had always been kept in check by one another. They were never united, and so the emperor could play them against each other when the need was nearest. But here they stood as one, chanting. This must have been a terrifying moment. The emperor's guard hastily led him out of his box and down the specially constructed tunnel that connected his seat in the hippodrome to the palace. The emperor was shaken, but he wasn't going to be cowed by the mob. They'd likely fall back into their rivalries before nightfall. But the mob, now united, flooded out into the streets of Constantinople, burning and looting as they went. They made their way to the palace and set the palace gate ablaze, but the fire spread. First, the Church of Sancta Sophia, the great center of worship for the capital, caught alight and was consumed by the flames. Then the baths, the great baths of Zeuxippus, the baths built by Constantine himself when he founded the city, adorned with treasures assembled from around the world, fell victim to the flame, the ash and tinder of antiquity floating off into the night sky. By dawn, much of the Augustium, the palace quarter, was in cinders. But when the city woke, it wasn't the stunned and subdued city Justinian had hoped for. For 5 more days, the riot burned through the city. The palace was under siege, the prison was razed to the ground, and its prisoners loosed. And through all this, fire. Fire spread through every quarter, burnt its way through the wood and timber, leaping from house to house as the riot raged around it. And the riot itself was a servant of the fire, keeping those who would try to stay it, those who were part of the bucket brigades or part of the civic corps, fighting in the streets while the city burned. And then, on Sunday the 18th, as smoke covered Constantinople and nearly a quarter of the largest city in the world lay in smoldering ruin, the crowd again gathered for the games. Justinian, cowed for perhaps the only time in his career, came out and told the crowd he would give their men pardon. But now that wasn't enough. The crowd shouted that they wanted evil officials removed. They shouted for removal of the city prefect, the man who had been responsible for the arrest of their leaders in the first place. This was to be expected. Justinian acquiesced. Then the crowd called out the names of Trebonian, Justinian's legal advisor who had rewritten the law code, and John the Cappadocian, the empire's taxman. Justinian was stunned. These men were corrupt, but their corruption didn't particularly
Gotta put your foot down at it. You're just giving them. They're just gonna keep asking.
affect the poor citizens of Constantinople. This wasn't the sort of request the mob would make. No, affect the poor. Justinian was stunned. These men were corrupt, but their corruption didn't particularly affect the poor citizens of Constantinople. This wasn't the sort of request the mob would make. No, this meant they were being backed by senators, by powerful men, perhaps some of the very same men who took shelter with him in the palace, who stood next to him while the mob howled outside. This spooked Justinian. He accepted these terms. He offered a full pardon to everyone involved. But even this wasn't enough. Clearly, the crowd had been primed. In their fury, they called for a new emperor. Justinian again retreated to his palace and conferred with his advisors. He began to make plans to take the treasury and those men loyal to him and board ships to flee across.
God, I thought his head was on a pike for a second.
He began to make plans to take the treasury and those men loyal to him and board ships to flee across the Bosporus. Meanwhile, the mob raged through the city. The nephews to Anastasius, the previous emperor, still lived. Why were the people of Constantinople serving as slaves to this upstart emperor born a peasant when they had men of royal blood that they could elevate to the purple? As the riots had spread over the preceding days, most of Anastasius's remaining kin had fled the city, but one aging relative of the old emperor remained, a man named Hypatius. Hypatius never wanted to be emperor. In fact, he was hiding under his bed when the mob arrived, but they found him and carried him on their shoulders back to the hippodrome to crown him and proclaim him their emperor. But as this was happening, Theodora, Empress of Rome, looked at the trembling men around her, counseling her husband to flee, and said, "Whether or not a woman should give an example of courage to men is neither here nor there. At a moment of desperate danger, one must do what one can. I think that flight, even if it brings us to safety, is not in our interest. Every man born to see the light of day must die, but that one who has been emperor should become an exile I cannot bear. May I never be without the purple I wear, nor live to see the day when men do not call me your majesty. If you wish safety, my lord, that is an easy matter."
Okay, I was gonna say that's pretty good, but now you seem sort of like a psycho.
"We are rich, and there is the sea, and yonder our ships. But consider whether if you reach safety, you may not desire to exchange that safety for death. As for me, I like the old saying, that the purple is the noblest shroud." There was a silence in the hall, and shame. Then Justinian said, "Get me Belisarius, Mundus, and Narses." While the palace guards had not been enough
Purple is the noblest shroud. So, like, dying as a royal beats dying as anything else, even if it means living longer? Or...
to quell the riots, as luck would have it, Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general, happened to be in the city waiting to be reassigned.
Go do
and
it.
Mundus, the great Germanic general who had long defended the empire's northern frontier, was also passing through the city on his way to take up Belisarius's old post. Neither of them had their armies with them, but they did have their personal legions. At Justinian's command, they gathered their men. The last man Justinian gathered, Narses, was a deceptively frail man, a thin Armenian eunuch serving in the palace. Justinian trusted Narses. Narses was his master.
Eunuch. Jeez. So that means... okay.
Master of the Trajan eunuch serving in the palace. Justinian trusted Narses. Narses was his master of the treasury, and as a eunuch, Narses could never become emperor, so Justinian could ask Narses to do the very thing that had allowed his family to usurp the throne in the first place.
Because he couldn't have a child, or just eunuchs couldn't become emperor no matter what, or...
Ask Narses to do the very thing that had allowed his family to usurp the throne in the first place. Take a big bag of money, slip out of the palace, and bribe those opposing him. Narses made his way to the hippodrome, unnoticed, quietly following the stair that took him to the box where the leaders of the Blues stood as the crowd shouted and cheered for Hypatius. Narses reminded them that Justinian favored the Blues, and you know that Hypatius guy's a green, right? Before putting a small stack of gold in each of their hands. Soon after, members of the Blues started to silently disperse. But the hippodrome was still filled with tens of thousands of Blues and Greens milling about the arena floor. Belisarius planned a commando raid to snatch Hypatius and flee, but he found the way blocked, so the order was given. Belisarius and his men entered from the east, while Mundus entered from the west. They marched in a line, cutting down all before them. People panicked and fled, clambered over each other, were trampled as they ran, but impassive, the soldiers marched on. By the end of the day, 30,000 people lay dead in the hippodrome, and Justinian's reign would never be challenged again. 30,000 people lay dead in the hippodrome.
Jesus.
And Justinian's reign would never be challenged again. Join us next week as we watch Justinian rebuild Constantinople, and Belisarius sets out to recapture the West.
Awesome channel, awesome videos. We will get to part 4 soon. My opinion of Justinian is... sort of unchanged, I guess. I need to learn more, okay? Alright. Cool though, I love Belisarius, he's awesome. Hope you guys are doing well. Can answer any questions I had, or comment any of your comments in the comment section. See you guys soon. Hope you're doing well. Chin up if not. You'll be good soon, don't worry. Bye guys.